The Poetry Nook is a cozy monthly conversation about the magic of poetry as a mirror and container for our lives. In each episode, we bring a poem to the table, or two or three, on a theme that speaks to us, and talk through all the language, logic, and emotions that come with them. I'm Charlie Hunt.
And I am Analia Gomez-Vidal. Welcome to the Poetry Nook.
Hi, Annie, how are you?
I'm, hanging in here. I exist. That has been my mantra as I was sharing just a minute ago. How are you doing, Charlie?
I also seem to exist still, so, some days that's all we can do. At the very least, we will always have poetry. Is it Poetry Month? Is that right?
April is Poetry Month.
April is Poetry Month, okay.
We are recording this in April. Happy National Poetry Month, Charlie.
Happy National Poetry Month. So we'll probably release this at the beginning of May, but it'll cap off National Poetry Month because we need poetry all months of the year, don't we? And in honor of National Poetry Month, we are bringing a couple of poems to the table here today. We're each going to bring one on the theme of something we've referred to before, this idea of Ars Poetica, which is essentially a poem that's about poetry. Annie, what do you make of this this practice that poets have sometimes of writing, using their creative output to write about the writing of a poem or to write about poetry as a concept? It's very meta, I feel like.
I have to say, I have not found myself doing that or kind of like inspired to write poetry about poetry yet. Although I have found myself like writing multiple times about writing, about kind of like the practice of writing, how I see myself as a writer. There are some commonalities to it, but in some ways, like all of us relate to poetry in a very personal way that sometimes escapes words. And so I think like that's where I can see very fitting that poetry about poetry allows us to really connect as poets and as lovers of poetry in a way that the words by themselves may not always help us.
It's a really interesting approach that poets have to writing these kinds of Ars Poetica poems where this is their vocation. It's something that's really important to them. And so not only are they undertaking the act of writing the poem, but they are making their vocation the subject of the poem, which gives, I think you're right, I think it gives us, the readers, who are meant to consume the poem and have it strike us however it strikes us, sort of brings us into their world from their lens in a way that is, I think, tough to do sometimes with certain professions. Like I'm a professional political scientist, and I teach, and I'm always happy when politics is like not part of my daily life. But it's also interesting because people want to talk to me about it sometimes, and that's a situation where I sometimes feel like in talking to them about politics, I'm like engaging in that role as an educator, but then I'm also talking about what it's like for me to teach my students about politics. Maybe that's like an Ars Poetica, perhaps. So I don't know. I mean, it's this meta way of thinking about it, but I do think it gives us, these kinds of poems can give us a new lens through which then we can look back at other poems that aren't necessarily in the Ars Poetica category, but it gives us that eye of the creator, or at least a taste of it, before we dive back in.
What's interesting about it, too, is, going kind of like building on that Ars Poetica point that you just made, that as you were saying, that what came to my mind is, like we're both political scientists and we also love poetry. I, over the years, and especially as a poet writing poetry, I have become more and more used to seeing like poetry as a lens to understand the world and to kind of like filter experience and observe more intentionally. And I feel very similarly about politics. because whether it's our our training or the way that we experience the world, there is very much this idea of, at least for me, like everything is politics. Like the personal is political. There is everything can be understood through the lens of politics. And so in some ways it's not surprising maybe that we share that combination of both, filtering everything through politics and at the same time filtering everything through poetry, and finding kind of that balance between what can be despair and also joy and hope.
If we think of a poet in the same way as in another creative pursuit, like say, a photographer, it's important for the photographer not just to sort of be looking out at the world and understanding their subjects, but to understand what kind of lens they use and what kind of camera they have and how to manipulate that stuff. And sometimes, a lot of the things I get served on my social media, I'm not even a big movie person, but I am often served up things of oh, how did this shot get designed? Or how did they, in this space movie, how did Ryan Gosling float through the spaceship or something? How did they do that behind the scenes? And it's I am not a filmmaker, I will never be a filmmaker, but I have that interest, and it gives me a new way of looking at the movie. And I feel watching, for example, filmmakers talk about that, or, a stuntman talking about how he did a particular stunt, it's very similar, I think. And it sort of takes us in an interesting way out of the world of the poem and lets us sort of look at it from the outside in a way that I think is really interesting. So why don't we hear one of these?
Yes. So I found a poem by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer, an icon in Argentine literature. I also shout out to Reddit and Tumblr that helped me find both the Spanish and the English version of it.
Always. Yes.
So the poem very much is Ars Poetica. And so I'm going to start by reading the Spanish version and then the translation by W.S. Merwin. So this is Arte Poética by Jorge Luis Borges. Mirar el río hecho de tiempo y agua y recordar que el tiempo es otro río, saber que nos perdemos como el río y que los rostros pasan como el agua. Sentir que la vigilia es otro sueño, que sueña no soñar y que la muerte que teme nuestra carne es esa muerte de cada noche que se llama sueño. Ver en el día o en el año un símbolo de los días del hombre y de sus años, convertir el ultraje de los años en una música, un rumor y un símbolo. Ver en la muerte el sueño, en el ocaso, un triste oro, tal es la poesía, que es inmortal y pobre. La poesía vuelve como la aurora y el ocaso. A veces en las tardes una cara nos mira desde el fondo de un espejo. El arte debe ser como ese espejo que nos revela nuestra propia cara. Cuentan que Ulises, harto de prodigios, lloró de amor al divisar su Ítaca, verde y humilde. El arte es esa Ítaca, de verde eternidad, no de prodigios. También es como el río interminable, que pasa y queda y es cristal de un mismo Heráclito inconstante, que es el mismo y es otro, como el río interminable. And now I'll read the translation, as I mentioned, by W.S. Merwin. Ars Poetica. To look at the river made of time and water, and remember that time is another river, to know that we are lost like the river, and that faces dissolve like water. To be aware that waking dreams, it is not asleep, while it is another dream, and that the death that our flesh goes in fear of is that death which comes every night and is called sleep. To see in the day or in the year a symbol of the days of man and of his years, to transmute the outrage of the years into a music, a murmur of voices, and a symbol. To see in death sleep and in the sunset a sad gold, such is poetry, which is immortal and poor, Poetry returns like the dawn and the sunset. At times in the evenings, a face looks at us out of the depths of a mirror. Art should be like that mirror, which reveals to us our own face. They say that Ulysses, sated with marvels, wept tears of love at the sight of his Ithaca, green and humble. Art is that Ithaca of green eternity, not of marbles. It is also like the river with no end that flows and remains and is the mirror of one same, in constant Heraclitus, who is the same and is another, like the river with no end.
Thank you for reading that, Annie. Very, very beautifully read and a beautiful poem. Lots of different phrases that are sticking out to me already, lots of different lines and stanzas. And I certainly have some of my own thoughts. But I wonder either how you stumbled across this poem, or where do you sort of see it situated as a kind of poem about poetry?
So as usual, I just go ahead and start doing research about like Ars Poetica and like poems about the themes that we are going to discuss. And I have a few places that I would go to naturally. But then I came across this one pretty quickly. And it was the first time that I came across this poem. And I will say, I usually do not really have a strong preference for whether it is like the Spanish version or the English version. But this one, I absolutely love it in Spanish. Like there is something about it in Spanish that I cannot quite grasp in English. And so that in and of itself was kind of like an interesting experience to, come in with a poem that I prefer in one language. But then the other thing about it is that there are multiple ways in which the imagery of the poem really speaks to me. Just for example, like the section where we're talking about like sleeping and like dreaming as like death is one of those things that spoke tremendously to me, especially as someone who very much exists in that space of researching about like dreams and stories and myths and all of that kind of like oniric intelligence side of our existence. And then the wordplay, just like the way that the poem, especially in Spanish, like that's such a beautiful job with the wordplay, was something that immediately caught my attention.
I do want to say that the themes around death and sleep and dreams, I think, were also really resonant with me here. It was a nice way of using those metaphors as a way of talking about poetry, that whatever sort of poem we're dealing with, whatever the subject is, the poem itself is not the same thing as the subject. Even if it's really faithful, even if it's really well written, even if it's really creative, whatever it is you're writing a poem about, whether it's an historical event or a loved one or a terrible thing that happened to you or an amazing thing that happened to you, it can be really personal, and it can do this mirroring and reflecting that Borges talks about. But there's sort of no getting around the fact that it is a copy or like a simulacrum or it's something that is parallel alongside it and is offering one particular kind of creative perspective on the event or the person or whatever the subject is. And this, to me, like, this is what dreams do, and this is what happens when we sleep. That when we sleep, we can't, first of all, it's got a creative aspect to it in that, like, we can't control our dreams. At least I can't. If I could, I would definitely have better dreams. But our brains are sort of replicating moments of our lives and like bringing in people or symbols or things, or mixing things up in ways that aren't, our dreams very rarely totally mirror reality or even partially mirror reality. Like, I have really weird dreams all the time, but they don't spring out of nothing. They reflect in certain ways the world as it is, or memories I have, or things like that. And poetry is sort of doing the same thing. At least that is sort of how I interpreted at least some of how and maybe why Borges here was referencing sleep and dreams and things like that as a way of talking about the imperfect, but I don't mean that in a negative way, but the sort of not 100% faithful way in which any poem reflects its subject.
So it's interesting. I have a complementary approach to what you shared just now. And I think it's also because my relationship both with poetry and dreams is slightly different. In the sense that one of the verses that I loved the most was the one where, it says basically that art must be as a mirror that reveals our own face to ourselves. A lot of the studying and training that I have been doing has to do a lot with like transpersonal psychology and the school of thought around really understanding ourselves from a perspective that integrates both, our waking life and our relationship with the subconscious and with the transpersonal world. And so when I think about dreams and I think about poetry, I think of both of them as parts of who we are and vehicles that allow for us to get to know ourselves and who we are in a much more expansive way than, what we traditionally access during our waking hours. I think I shared with you not too long ago that, even starting this project together was featured in my dreams at some point without really knowing until it actually manifested and took shape. And so that's part of what I think perhaps connects me more emotionally with that is the thinking of these are complementary to our waking life in a way that expands our sense of self.
Yeah, and it's I feel like we have sort of two parallel things going on here in that I think are both really valid, which is that like poetry is really powerful, at least to me, when it does really lean into this mirror aspect and when it does speak to like really feel like it feels like, wow, this poet understands me. Like they've never met me, but they have captured this emotion or this way of talking about something so perfectly because it's exactly the way that I think about it, or it brought out that way of thinking about it that I didn't even know I was doing, but has perfectly mirrored me in this way. And this is one of the kinds of magical aspects of poetry. But I am also really moved by poetry sometimes without even really understanding why it's happening or how it's happening. There is this sort of mystical aspect to it. My scientist mind is usually like, okay, let's get down to business. Like, why did this poem really speak to me? Like, is it like it's a math equation to figure out or like a stats problem? Sometimes poetry really does make sense, but then sometimes it doesn't. But that doesn't mean it can't hit home, draw out these ideas or creative feelings that we didn't even know were there and mean a lot to us in that way as well.
And I will say, I think that, like going back to the wordplay, I also really like the way in which like that wordplay allowed for multiple visuals, images that, like we constantly think about, connected in a way that is like very intentional and like playful in the different stanzas. So I'm curious if there is any stanza in particular that caught your attention in that regard.
I mean, a couple of different things and phrases that jumped out at me, and I'm also curious as I give a couple to you, whether you maybe feel like the translation captured that for you, or whether you think maybe the original said something more interesting or more complex that you like. So I'll just give a couple. So the calling poetry a sad gold. It is simple, like two very short one-syllable words after each other. This gold we think of as incredibly valuable and glittering, But then in the very next line, such as poetry, which is immortal and poor, right? Poor is kind of the opposite of gold. And so that's an example of something that was kind of wonderfully mystifying to me that I'm still kind of trying to figure out, but I just let it hit me for whatever it is. We talked about the mirror when he says, art should be like that mirror which reveals to us our own face. And also bringing through the river metaphor the entire time. Like a river, water is something you can also see your own reflection in sometimes. Although it's usually difficult when it's moving so quickly like a river, like time can, right? And so, time and water are in this river and they are moving by quickly. And the faces dissolve in it. Those faces dissolve like water. And I thought that was an interesting kind of play on words where water is something you can see your reflection in, but it's also something that you can't hold on to with your hands. Like you can't grab onto. It's not secure. It's always moving. Much like our faces and our identities. So I thought that was appropriate and really interesting. So those are just a couple that jumped out to me.
Yeah, and those are pretty much translated from like the Spanish as it shows. But I also really appreciated that contrast, both of like the triste oro, like the this idea of like a sad gold that I think also speaks to me because of, I spend a lot of time wondering and thinking about success, right? And sometimes, we have a expression in Spanish, it's no todo lo que brilla es oro, like not everything is gold. And so I think that speaks to this sense of like not everything that we think is, all that great is necessarily so, but on the other hand, like there is this immortality. I'm puzzled by the use of poor here, and I wonder, like to what extent it's almost like taking it away from any kind of like moral judgment that often gets projected into that word, but kind of like thinking about it from a different perspective. And this touches on one of the differences in the translations that to me makes it richer in Spanish. The stanza where like he refers to Ithaca, and like in the Spanish version it reads that like cuentan que Ulises harto de prodigios lloró de amor al divisar su Ítaca. Verde y humilde, el arte es esa Ítaca de verde eternidad, no de prodigios. And the reason why I like that in particular in Spanish is because in the translation, Merwin translates it as marvels. And I didn't go into detail about kind of like, like the parallels in marvels and prodigios, but in Spanish, prodigios, the way that I read it is, kind of like the whiz kids, right? Like the people that we kind of like prodigies. And so there is to me a layer of ego that is present in that word that when you read it in Spanish, it's like it's not about the egos of the prodigies. It's more like the nature and the truth of Ithaca and its like greenery and so on. And I think that gets lost in that translation in English.
Well, and what you've just described contrasts, I think, more clearly with the verde humilde, right? The humility that's green and humble. That It is not this sort of prodigy. It is not all. Some poetry is showy, but like it's not. It's usually a simplifying, humbling experience to read a really good poem. It's not something that is always dazzling you. The Ithaca of green eternity, that again, that sort of relates to this idea of it as immortal, that by events come and go and people come and go, but you can write a poem about them and they'll live forever, right? And so even though like the river flowing, right, it seems like these things these subjects, whatever we're writing about, can get away from us or be forgotten, that art generally, and I think poetry specifically, is immortal. It returns like the dawn and the sunset, which covers everything, right? The dawn and the, like, those are the those are the bookends of the day and the night. And as Borges has made clear, like the nighttime during sleep and dreams, like it is active then as well. And so it has this sort of ever present and eternal aspect to it that I think is gotten at really nicely in that stanza, and I think sort of matches well with this humble aspect, right? It's immortal and it's living forever, but it's not flashy. In fact, it's poor, right? It's this sad gold. And so it's not, it has that complication to it. Well, do you mind if I move on to my poem that I have brought to the table? I don't know if you had a chance to read it beforehand, but I'll read it for us now, and it's one that I think takes maybe a more direct and visceral view of poetry that I'm interested to get into, especially in comparison to the Borges poem. So this is by Ada Limón, who is one of the more recent poet laureates of the United States. She's one of my favorite poets. I've got a few anthologies of hers on my shelf, and this is one of my very favorite poems of hers, and it's called "The End of Poetry." Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot, enough chiaroscuro, enough of thus and prophecy, and the stoic farmer, and faith, and our father, and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God, not forgetting, and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on, and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling, and the rising, and the looking inward, and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, and the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser, enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego, enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child, and enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border, enough of can you see me, can you hear me, enough I am human, enough I am alone, and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me, enough of the high water, enough sorrow, enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me.
Such a beautiful poem.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. In a way, it's a poem all about how, you have this deep need to touch or be touched. And she's saying basically like, to hell with all the flowery poetic language, I'm asking you to touch me. But of course, in writing this poem, she has written a thing of incredible textual beauty, very ironically. So that's one of the reasons I really love it. Like, it's all about like the end of poetry, this isn't actually what she's saying, but like that, we don't need all this poetry, all this poetic language. We just need me asking you to touch me and feel something. But, she's done it in this way that manages to get across all of this other stuff that she is saying we don't need, or enough of that.
It's such a beautiful way of ending the poem. And to me, the main message that I got from it is, while we were talking about Borges and, this Ars Poetica, where we are kind of like being in the abstract, right? Like in the ethereal. Ada Limón allows us to basically kind of like come to earth and asks us to embody. Because I think that part of like what often happens to a lot of us, the poetic type, is that it is very easy for us to get lost in the ethereal, in the abstract, in the ideas, in the imagining and romanticizing and idealizing. And in some ways, poetry, at least in my perspective and my experience, it allows me to put it in more concrete terms, because I kind of like bring it down to the words and on the paper. But even then, we often run the risk of just observing and remaining observers of reality and its ever, like ever-growing level of detail and nuance. And so in some ways, what I really loved about this poem was basically like cutting through some of that escapism and into the embodiment of our lives. But basically just like, let's move away from that poetry and just be corporal.
I've wondered in different moments when I've read this poem, I wonder if it's an interesting kind of perspective shift for her. Like, she's a poet and she writes very beautiful poetry. She has probably written about many of the subjects here that she's saying enough of. Like, I could imagine this poem as coming from the perspective of like a partner of a poet, of like, enough already with all of your flowery language and your like, poetic ways of getting at this. Like, let's cut to the chase. I'm asking you to touch me. Like, could this be from the perspective of like a loved one in her life who is saying like, okay, I get it. I'm beautiful as the chickadee and the sunflower and all of this stuff, but like, enough of that. I'm asking you to touch me. I think it's a really self-aware poem. I think not just in terms of Limon herself, but like thinking about poets and poetry. Like, I think this is the perspective, the literal kind of perspective that a lot of people who aren't into poetry have about poetry, of like, oh God, they'll just keep going on and on about all this stuff and try to make it like, oh, we have to get at this through a metaphor or through this sort of twisted way of approaching it in order to be like faux artistic. I think this is like the very cynical view of poetry that a lot of people have, and in a weird way, and I think a really self-aware way, she's kind of capturing that here. And then also, ironically, through the listing of all these things, is getting through the complexity of the emotion that is actually behind that last very powerful line in the poem.
Yesterday, I had a conversation with a dear friend of mine, and she shared, a struggle that she was going through, a very real, concrete struggle. And within half an hour, I found myself just connecting that to a memory of my own and writing a draft of a poem. I mentioned to her, this might sound weird, but I just wrote a poem about this. She just thumbs up the message, which, like, in my mind, very much connected to this kind of like reaction of like, no, I'm talking about this one problem. I don't need your poetry right now.
That's so funny. It's a bit of an eye roll, right? I mean, I think this poem is like a loving eye roll towards poetry, which makes me just love it all the much more. Because honestly, like when I started reading poetry and was really into my sort of first phase of being really into poetry, like in high school, when I was really young. Like, I know I tried to write some poems, and fortunately, unlike you, I do not have any of these poems. But I think I was probably writing poems that used a lot of this flowery language, and frankly, my writing generally used to lean into like the big words and the flowery language and the interesting metaphor and all this stuff. And that was my way of compensating for the fact that I wasn't actually saying anything real. All writers feel that way, I think, from time to time. But what to me is so genius about this poem is that, like, she is getting across that emotion, that sort of feeling about poetry of like, oh, you're just like using all these words, but not saying the thing that really needs to be said. But she's actually doing both in the poem, which is just, I think, like, ingenious. Some poems are much more abstract, and sometimes they are so abstract that it can kind of leave me feeling a little bit like I'm surging down the river that Borges talked about with no paddle and no awareness of where I even am. And all poetry is beautiful in its own way, but I have generally found myself, and I'm curious to know whether this is the case for you or if you feel differently. When I really started to get my second phase of getting back into poetry, starting about 10 years ago, and really, putting together all my flags and all that stuff, I found myself really drawn to poems that were very simple and that were fairly literal and that were about basic everyday life. And that didn't mean they couldn't be powerful, but that were plainly written and that didn't seem like they required like a 400 level poetry course in order to decode or decipher, which I think explains why I like this poem so much. I'm curious if that's the same relationship you have with poetry or if yours is a little bit different.
Yeah, it's a slightly different, and I think it's informed by this like duality of both like reading poetry and writing poetry. As you were describing it, I think I can identify like three phases, let's say, right? Like there was an initial, and the word that came to my mind was purpose. Because for me, growing up, and I still have a lot of the poems that I wrote as a kid, and we shared one of them, but the growing up, those poems focused a lot more, from what I see now, in the kid that I was trying to make sense of the feelings that I felt. And so I would write and engage with poetry as a way of like trying to verbalize or articulate what my emotional and inner experience was. Mm-hmm. And then for the longest time, I kind of like felt detached from it, and I would perhaps appreciate poetry and literature in general as a way of like observing more of the world. But then in more recently and in my own poetry, I shared recently my first collection on Patreon, Biopsy of Emotional Dead Ends. And that, for example, like everything that I have been writing has less to do with trying to understand or articulate how I'm feeling and more kind of like excavating and putting on paper what I have been feeling, or kind of like doing that exercise of having gained the clarity of what I am going through. I'm just going to like be more visceral and upfront about it. And so like that has like evolved in that way for me.
I don't write poetry, and so I don't really have the perspective on it, but I could imagine, writing a poem out of a sense of uncertainty and sort of writing a poem as a way of trying to gain that clarity versus, okay, this is something I have like thought about for years. This is a subject I have like beaten to death in my own mind and feel like I have my arms around, and so now I can excavate it and write about it. And I feel like those are two interesting, different sort of ways of approaching the process of writing a poem.
I think there is something to be said about being able to kind of like connect with whether it's poetry or prose, like a lot of people like journaling. And so it's like being able to connect with yourself and what your experience is. And what's interesting about it, like when I was putting together this collection, these are poems that I wrote a long time ago. And for a lot of them, I can place myself in the places that I was writing them, and I can like see myself in the emotions that I was feeling, and a lot of the times I was writing while sobbing. But then coming back to them years later to put them together, it was both an exercise in, like growing and trusting my voice, and with a lot of help with a lot of like dear friends of mine who are also poets and writers. But then the experience of reading those poems now is a very different one from when I was writing it. And I think like that is like also a beautiful thing about knowing that everyone, even myself, will relate very differently to the moment that those words were put on paper.
And since we're on this particular subject already of like this idea of being a poet and what it means to be a poet in the sense of these kinds of Ars Poetica. I'm going to take prerogative and briefly read this last poem that I wasn't sure if I was going to share, but since it's not by W.S. Merwin, but you mentioned that that the Borges poem was translated by Merwin, and Merwin gets a mention in this poem. And it's a poem about sort of what we're talking about right now. So we don't have to, there's not too much to say about it. But I'm just going to briefly read it if that's all right.
Go ahead.
So this is a poem by Billy Collins, another former U.S. poet laureate. Probably one of the more popular poets of the last 20, 30 years. And this poem is called "If This Were a Job, I'd Be Fired." When you wake up with nothing, but you are nonetheless drawn to your sunny chair near the French doors, it may be necessary to turn to some of the others to get you going. So I opened a book of Gerald Stern, but I didn't want to face my age by writing about my childhood in the 1940s. Then I read Two Little Merwins, which made me feel I should apply for a position in a corner sandwich shop. And it took only one simic, which ended with a couple on a rooftop watching a child on fire leap from a window, to get me to replace the cap on my pen, put on some sweatpants, and go for a walk around the lake to think of a new career. But not before I told you all about it in, well, look at this, 5 quatrains. Better than nothing for a weekday, I thought, as I headed merrily out the door. It's very...
I love it.
I mean, it's great, right? I mean, it's, again, not like too much to say about it, but it's like, on the one hand, it's capturing the strange, charmed everyday work life it must be if you're a professional poet and like that's all you do for a living. If you're someone like Billy Collins, like he's walking around and he sits in his sunny chair and but it's also super relatable in its own way of like, when I can't get the creative juice, it's like I cannot write a paragraph to save my life or like get this thing done that I've been wanting to get done. And so I'll like, read something else by someone else, and I'll be like, well, I shouldn't even be doing this because all this stuff is so good. And I think there are a lot of relatable feelings in there about what it would be like to have the job of a poet.
It is very meta in multiple ways, because I think it works in terms of, like the experience of a poet. It works in the experience of anyone doing any type of creative work. And I'm going to include research here because we all went through that process as well. And it also works for anyone who has experienced this, because ultimately, in my mind, what to me this poem reflects so beautiful is the experience of procrastination.
Yes.
Not because like we seek to procrastinate, but because like we are kind of like caught in that moment of when is the inspiration or the idea or the energy going to come, so that we are able to like fulfill the task. And so I think we all have had those moments across jobs.
Yeah. And it's great because he stumbles into a poem, like by writing about this frustration that, like, I'm sure this is a very literal translation of what happened in a day that he had. And so then he just sat down and like was like, you know what, I'm just going to write about that, and then I'm going for a walk around the lake. Whenever we're talking about Ars Poetica, there's going to be some meta aspect to it in a way, and I think there have been with all 3 of the poems we've talked about today. But that's definitely present here in that, like, we have ended up with a poem, and like by accident or whatever, like he did his job, whatever his job is, and I love that. So, as he says, better than nothing for a weekday. So good job, Billy.
Yeah. And with that, we are getting to the close of our Ars Poetica episode, where we are honoring National Poetry Month.
That's right. It's sad to see it come to an end, but, we'll just make the executive decision and make May National Poetry Month also. Every month for us is National Poetry Month here in the Nook.
Every day in the Nook is a poetry day.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Have a good one.